Hi everybody. We'll get back to finish that chapter in the fields of home now. I was interrupted. Well, let's see. Where was I here? The plow was in the sheep barn all right, 3/4 buried in the store and manure. There was no crevice for the double trees, and it was thick with rust. One handle was cracked. The point on the share was as blunt as a hog's nose. That's pretty blunt. I stopped to find a crevice, screw an iron plate under the handle, and scrape a little of the rust from the moldwood. Then, when I was ready to start for the high field, the yellow colt decided to put on a show. The second he heard the double G's dragging behind his heels, he acted as if he were trying to kick a hole in the sky. Not even a wire on his ears would stop him. He didn't balk, but every forward step, he kicked both heels higher than my head. I was sure Grandfather would send me right back home if he caught me, but there was only one thing to do. I unhitched the colt, tied him, went to the barn for a piece of rope. Grandfather was still down at the beehives. When I went back to the sheep barn, I hitched the old horse to the plow again, passed the end of the rope around a hind leg, knotted a loop in it, let it slip down around his fetlock. I tied the other end low on the cannon of his outside foreleg, picked up the lines and clucked. The yellow colt hesitated half a second, as if he was deciding what to do. Then took a quick step forward and kicked. Half a second later, he was lying flat on his side, his head propped up like a diving duck coming out of the water, and he looked all around to see what had happened to him. After the third dumping, he kept his heels down, but he pranced all the way to the high field. Grandfather must have seen us going up the hill by the orchard. When I looked back, he had left the beehives. He and old Bess were coming slowly across the hayfield. I'd driven a team for Father when he plowed. We always started the field from the center. That way, the horses didn't tread over the already plowed ground at the corners. Father and I had always counted the steps across each end of a field and set up a marker stake where it would be the same distance from each side and the end. By making the first furrow between the two stakes, plowing would come out even all around the field. While I was waiting for Grandfather, I tied the horses, found a couple of marker sticks, began stepping off the high field. I was right in the middle of it when he shouted, "What kind of games be you up to now? Thought Mary sent you down here to help me plow." I didn't like his shouting at me before I'd been back 2 hours, and answered, "No, sir. Uncle Levi asked me to come down, help out till you got well again. But now I'm here, I'll help you plow if you want me to. I've got the end of this field nearly stepped off." "You've what?" Grandfather shouted and yanked the yellow colt's hitch line off the post where I tied it. "I've stepped off this end of the field." "What kind of tannel fool business is that? Come over here and take these reins. Get up, get up." When Grandfather yelled, "Get up," the yellow colt lunged forward, stopped, and went into a fit of kicking. At every kick, he was jumping about a foot backwards. He was going right toward the tip-down plow. Instead of throwing the plow over, Grandfather ducked out of the way himself and shouted louder, "Get up, get up! Whoa, whoa, you tannel fool horse! Whoa, I tell you!" I ran as fast as I could, grabbed the reins out of Grandfather's hands, and whaled the ends of them down across the yellow colt's rump, just as his heels smashed the spreader bar between the plow handles. The colt looked around when I hit him, and must have remembered the kick rope. He jumped forward beside old Nell and stood dancing. "What in time and tarnation did you go fiddle-faddling off and leave your horses for?" Grandfather stormed at me. "Ain't I told you time and again the colt's high-strung? Now look what you done to the plow." I didn't look what I'd done to the plow. I looked right at Grandfather. Then I turned and started through the gap in the stone wall. "Gory sakes alive, Ralphie," he said before I'd taken more than 3 steps. "Your old grandpa didn't calculate on being cross to you. Never seen a critter in all my born days so contrary as that tannel colt. There's times he riles me." "There are times I get riled too," I said as I turned and looked back at him. Course you do, Ralphie. Tannel fool horse would rile a saint." He thought he meant. "Do you calculate we could patch the old plow up with a stick and a piece of fence wire? Might get 3, 4, half a dozen turns about the field before noontime." We fixed the plow so it would hold together all right. We only plowed 2 furrows around the field before noon, and I nearly ground my teeth flat. There were more and larger rocks under the ground than on top. Grandfather wouldn't drive the horses and let me plow. He was still too weak to have been plowing on any sort of ground. With the share point as dull as it was, the handles thrashed around like tree limbs in a storm. That's a picture. Plowing. That must be his grandfather holding the plow handles. Ha! Grandfather was thrown from one side to the other, and that every rock the size of a football was pitched up onto the crossbar. With every pitch, he yelled at me to watch what I was doing and stop trying to stave up everything on the place. If he wasn't scolding me, he was yelling either gee or haw or get up or whoa at the horses. G means for him to turn the horses to turn right. Haw means for him to turn left. The Teamsters language. Before he'd plowed around the field twice, Grandfather's shouting had the yellow colt as riled as it had me, and set him balking. The first time was just after we'd started the second round. With Grandfather right there, I couldn't put a wire on the old horse's ears. So I did the next best thing. I scooped up a handful of loose dirt, held his nostrils closed, and when he opened his mouth, tossed it in. Then I let him stand and spit dirt till he forgot about balking. Boy. The second balk came near the end of the second round. It was getting on toward noon. Grandfather was so tired he was staggering. I felt as though I'd explode if he yelled at me just once more. Of course, I knew I'd be making a lot of trouble for myself later if I let the yellow colt think he had won by balking. If I didn't, and we tried to make another round, I was sure it would end by my being sent home again, having to go without being sent. And though I don't know just why, I didn't want to go. I clucked to the yellow colt 2 or 3 times, clipped him with the end of the lines, and then looked back at Grandfather. Unhook him, he snapped. Ain't no sense fussing with a fool horse once he gets his head sawed on balking. He waited till I unhitched the team, then walked away toward the house with old Bess at his heels. When I went to the barn, I took the blended plowshare with me. All I knew about blacksmithing was what I learned from watching Uncle Levi and a smith in Littleton. That's Colorado. But I thought I could weld a point onto the share. As soon as I'd put the horses up, I built a fire in the forge, buried the share end in the heart of it, and found a short, thick bar of steel to weld on for a point. I pumped the bellows till the pieces were both white hot, then laid the bar over the blended plowshare point on the anvil, and whanged the heavy hammer down on it. The 2 pieces stuck together with the first blow. I kept pounding till I couldn't see where they joined. I had to heat the metal twice more before I had it hammered into the shape I wanted. Then, to harden it, I heated it to a bright red, plunged it into a tub of cold water. I hadn't seen Grandfather since I'd come in from the field, but I was so proud of the job I'd done, I wanted to show it to him. I picked up the plowshare. It had gone as far as the woodshed when I changed my mind. If I lugged the plowshare into the house, I'd only be trying to show him how smart I was. I took it back and laid it on the bench, but I put it where he'd be sure to see it if he came into the carriage house. Millie called dinner while I was giving the horses their noon grain. Grandfather was already at the table when I went to the house. He was so tired he could hardly hold up his head. Millie had evidently made a hot toddy when he'd first come in from the field, but he'd only taken a swallow or 2 and pushed it aside. "What was you hammering at the forge?" he asked when I'd finished washing. "I welded a new point on the plowshare," I told him. "Temper it soft?" he asked. "Them rocks raises Ned with a brittle point." I'd heard Father talk about tempering metal so it would be hard enough to hold an edge. When I'd asked the blacksmith in Littleton why he'd dumped hot steel into cold water, he said it was to temper it. I didn't know what Grandfather meant by tempering it soft, but I answered right back, "Yes, sir, I did a good job on it. It's on the bench in the carriage house if you want to see it." Grandfather rubbed one hand up over his head and said, "Goy, Ralphie, your old grandpa ain't as stout as he thought he was. He's just about all tuckered out." I drew a breath to say it would be easier if he drove the team and let me hold the plow. Then I thought what the yellow colt might do with Grandfather's driving, and changed to, would it be all right if I tried plowing alone? In them rocks, with the yellow colt? Might as well try to... Millie was at the stove, picking pieces of pork out of the frying pan. She hadn't said a word since I came into the house, but she broke in quickly. I'll drive the horses for you. No such of a thing, no such of a thing, Grandfather snapped at her. Ain't going to have no women folks working in the fields. Listen, it's haying time. Calculated I'll have to let the plowing go till my legs get a trifle stouter. Wanted to get it done before all the good of the dressing leached off the crown of the hill. Wasted enough on it on the downland already. The more he talked about it, the more I wanted to try plowing alone. So I said, it's my fault it was wasted. I'd like to try plowing alone if you'd let me. Grandfather turned to me quickly, and his face had a sort of puzzled look. What did you say, Ralphie? He asked. I said it was my fault that the dressing was wasted. I'd like to try plowing alone. Gory sakes, didn't look to hear you let on to it. Well, ain't no harm in trying if you want to. You take care of the yellow colt. He's powerful high-strung. I ate my dinner as fast as I could fork it into my mouth. Then, while the horses finished their hay, I took the sharpened plowshare to the high field and put it on the plow. When I came back for the horses, Grandfather was fussing around with some pieces of board in the carriage house. The plowing didn't go the way I'd hoped it would. The yellow colt had never liked me any better than I'd liked him. But before I went back to Boston, he just about stopped barking and drew fairly near what I wanted him to. Anyone could have seen he hated me when I came back. And I made a bad mistake before dinner. Just before I'd unhitched him the second time, he barked. He thought he had me buffaloed. He behaved pretty well till I had him hitched to the plow, and then he raised particular Cain. I'm almost to the end, Roxy, okay? Another page and a half after this. Took me nearly an hour to plow a furrow the length of the field. Before it was finished, the old colt had barked 4 times, thrown himself flat twice, broken the harness in a couple places. Every time I'd go near his head, he'd struck out at me like a wild stallion. There were times that I wanted to take a club to him, but it would only have made him worse, if possible. We were both dripping wet, and I used every trick I ever saw or heard of before he decided to settle down and work. And then the plowshare snapped, 3 inches from the point. I never hated to do anything much more than I hated to take the broken plowshare into the forge. When we'd hit the rock, hadn't dented the point at all, but it snapped it off like a piece of peanut brittle. I knew the fault was in the tempering, and I knew Grandfather would know it. As I came nearer the buildings, I could hear him hammering in the carriage house, and in my mind I could hear him call me a know-it-all, tannel fool boy. It wouldn't be a thing I could see either, because he'd be right. Grandfather was at the bench, mending a beehive, when I went into the carriage house. He looked up and asked, Yellow Colt bucking on you, Elfie? Why didn't you fetch him in? It isn't the yellow colt, I said. The plowshare broke. Grandfather came over to where I was laying the broken pieces on the anvil. Didn't I tell you to temper it soft? He snapped. Don't call that a soft temper, do you? No, sir, I said. It's as brittle as ice. Then why in time and tarnation did you tell me you tempered it soft? I wet my lips with my tongue and said, I don't know how to temper soft. I guess I was ashamed to tell you. Grandfather looked up at me the same way he had done at the dinner table. Then he picked up the pieces, looked at the break carefully. Got a pretty good weld on it, he said. Didn't bust at the joining. Think you could mend it again? I'm not sure. That's the first weld I ever made, but if I have good luck, I think I'd do it again. Supposing you try it. Then your old grandpa will learn you how to draw a temper. The first weld hadn't worried me. It never occurred to me that it might not come out all right. By the time I had the fire blown up hot, the pieces back in it, my mouth was as dry as the cinders. I knew I'd never be able to weld the 2 broken edges together. There'd be no way of getting at them to hammer them tight. As I pumped the bellows, I decided I'd have to flatten the end of the big piece a little, reverse the small one, sandwich one piece on top of the other. Before the red faded to pink and the pink to white, I picked up each piece half a dozen times with the tongs. When I lifted the larger one to the anvil, my hands were shaking a little. I hit 7 or 8 hard blows with the hammer, pushed it back into the heart of the fire, and waited for the red to fade. I was holding my breath when I lapped the 2 white-hot pieces together on the anvil and whanged them with a hammer. They stuck, and I found myself panting as if I'd just finished a mile race. Grandfather was still working at the bench. I began shaping a new point on the plowshare. I didn't notice him again until I had it all finished, and from right behind me, he said, "You've done it man fashion, Ralphie. Now leave your old grandpa to learn you how to draw a temper." He did the first part the way I had, brought the steel to a cherry red, then quenched it quickly in the water. As I pumped the bellows, he banked the cinders on one side of the forge, placed the hardened plowshare so the point lay over the fire, and said, "Now mack it careful, Ralphie, whilst the hardness draws away." After a while, he began lifting it from the fire and peering at it. There she be. Straw color. That's for butcher knives." He put it back, then lifted it again. "Brown. That's for plowing the valley ground." Next it was purple, Ralphie. Sled runners. Channel good ones. Another minute or two, he sang out, "There you be. Blue. That's how you want your axe head. Just coming blue. We'll give her another dite for them rocks." He gave it another minute's fire, and swept it away from the forge, fanned it back and forth, held it up for me to see. "Mack it, Ralphie. Mack the color. Blue as the sky of a starry night. Tough as rawhide. You'll dull it, but you'll never bust it." And that's the end of that chapter. Next one, tomorrow maybe, will be chapter 17. Title of that one is Grandfather Finds the Bees. We'll see what happens. Bye-bye, everybody.